Ladies and gentlemen, the VinFuture Prize 2022 Symposium, Science for Life, will begin shortly. Kindly take your seats and put your phones to silent mode. We will begin in a few minutes. Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to VinFuture Prize 2022. It's so nice to see everybody here today in person as well as online. The symposium today will create connections between the Vietnamese science and tech community, leading domestic and international scientists, as well as policymakers and entrepreneurs. The all-day symposium will have 3 consecutive 90-minute panels, each focusing on one of the following critical issues for the world: sustainable agriculture in the new normal, advanced materials for future energy storage, and personalized therapy in cancer treatment. The panel on each of these topics will focus on the pressing global issues, practical solutions, and predictions of key changes in people's lives through the contributions of science and technology. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of our distinguished guests, speakers, and VIPs today. We'd like to welcome Mr. Lê Quốc Doanh, former Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development. Regarding the VinFuture Prize Council, we'd like to introduce Professor Sir Richard Henry Friend, Chair of the VinFuture Prize Council. Welcome, sir. We'd like to welcome Professor Tu Quyên Nguyen, Co-Chair of the Pre-Screening Committee, as well as Professor Albert Pisano, Co-Chair of the Pre-Screening Committee. And last but not least, we'd also like to welcome the presence of domestic and international press and media units, as well as delegates from the VinFuture Prize Council, who took the time to attend today's Science for Life Symposium. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The Science for Life Symposium is an important event in the framework of the second VinFuture Prize Science and Tech Week. In addition to the interest of domestic and international leading scientists, our event also received special support from leaders of central departments, ministries, and agencies of Vietnam. Ladies and gentlemen, please give us a round of applause. Now, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things that we're going to be doing today is to actually look at several issues that are very important. And amongst those issues, we would like to begin our first panel discussion, Resilient Agriculture in the New Normal. Before we start, let us say a few words. Climate change affects agriculture in the agricultural economy. Amidst this new normal, in order for agriculture to develop sustainably, it is necessary to invest systematically in science and tech, as well as socio-economic policies. For now, we'd like to focus your attention on the screen for the upcoming clip.
Climate change. 2021 has witnessed such unpredictable records for the 4 climate change indicators. CO2 concentrations reached 413.2 parts per million globally. The average sea level rose 4.5 millimeters per year from 2013 to 2021. In 2022, the world will continue to observe many tremendous weather phenomena due to climate change. Tremendous consequence. The consequences of climate change, which declined agricultural productivity by 21% since 1961, also significantly affected arable land, provoking many diseases, causing plant pathogens and food crops with reduced protein content. In Vietnam, according to a report from the Southern Institute of Irrigation Science, is 0.96 centimeters per year. According to a warning from the United Nations Food Program, there are currently 345 million people in 82 countries at risk of hunger, and 70 million are on the edge of starvation. Practical solutions. Agriculture practices have been identified as adaptable to climate change, including smart irrigation and water management, application of improved plant varieties, agroforestry production, crop intercropping, sustainable land management, agricultural waste treatment, and improvement of agroclimatic information services.
It is up to the parties to show their determination and to reach a consensus, to reinforce the credibility of the UNFCCC process and to address through it the challenges related to climate change and the impacts that millions, the mitigation work program, the global goal and adaptation.
Climate change affects agribusiness and the agricultural economy by setting a new normal for the socio-economic system of each country and the whole world. Resilient agriculture in the new normal.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are also very pleased to announce our also special guest today. We'd like to welcome Mr. Bùi Thế Duy, Deputy Minister of Science and Technology. Welcome, sir. And ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bùi Thế Duy will also begin our event today with a speech. We'd like to invite Mr. Bùi Thế Duy, Deputy Minister of Science and Technology, to the stage for the event's opening speech. Xin trân trọng kính mời lên sân khấu ông Bùi Thế Duy, Thứ trưởng Bộ Khoa học Công nghệ, lên phát biểu khai mạc tọa đàm. Xin trân trọng kính mời ông.
Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, researchers. First of all, I'd like to welcome all of you here today to attend the Science and Life seminar within the frameworks of Science and Technology Week organized by VinFuture Foundations. Although it's just the second year, the activities to promote science and technology initiated and led by the VinFuture Foundations have already influenced the scientific communities. When attracting the participations of many experts, leading national and international researchers discussing emerging issues facing the whole world. Today's talk with the topic, Sustainable Agriculture in the New Normals, new materials for futures of energy storage, and individualized therapies in cancer treatments are even more meaningful when humanity has just experienced an unprecedented event, the COVID-19 pandemic. These are very practical scientific topics that can make a revolution in people's lives, especially in the process of reviving and reconstruction the ones after the pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be entering the first session with the theme Sustainable Agriculture in the New Normals of this talk series. As you might know, almost half of the populations in developing countries rely on agriculture for their livings. 75% of the world's poor live in the rural areas. Agriculture production is the sector most affected by climate change, but agriculture production is also one of the causes of climate change. So what is the solutions for agriculture that can balance and develop a sustainable agriculture, effectively adapting to climate change and increasing complex epidemics, as well as ensuring global food securities? An important factor in making a sustainable agriculture is finding a balance between the needs of food production and the preservation of the economy, of the ecosystem, environments, and public health. At the same time, it also promotes economic stability for farmers, helping farmers have a better quality of life. This challenge requires countries to have new directions, breakthrough solutions, and only science and technologies can do this. In Vietnam, science, technologies, and innovations are one of the important driving forces for Vietnam to become one of the top 15 countries in the world in exporting agricultural products. Currently, many Vietnamese branded agricultural products have been presented and can conquer the global market. It is estimated that science and technologies contribute over 30% of the added values in the agriculture sectors and about 38% of the added value in the production of plant varieties and livestock. Ladies and gentlemen, at the State Management Agency for Science, Technology and Innovation, the Ministry of Science and Technology highly appreciates the vision of VinFuture Foundations when choosing the theme Revival and Reconstructions for the second VinFuture Awards, as well as very topical and practical issue for today's Science for Life seminars, including the issue sustainable agriculture in the new normals, as well as the field related to new materials and biomedicals. The Ministry of Science and Technology also welcomed groundbreaking initiatives of the VinFuture Foundations. It is not just the VinFuture Award, the first annual Global Science and Technology Award initiated by Vietnamese, but also a series of regular activities and large-scale events to connect the world and Vietnamese scientific communities, promote academic exchange at the international levels, and at the same time, to promote science to serve humanity. I would like to wish the scientists attending today's talk, especially in the sustainable agriculture in the new normal discussion section, will join hands to contribute to effective solutions, practical applications, to make positive contribution to the world's revival and reconstructions. Wishing you all good health and wishing VinFuture Science and Technology Week and Seminar a great success. Thank you very much.
Xin cảm ơn Thứ trưởng. Thank you, Deputy Minister Bùi Thế Duy. Next up, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the chair and panelists of this discussion, Resilient Agriculture in the New Normal. The chair for this panel is Professor Ermias Kibrab, member of the VinFuture Pre-Screening Committee. Professor Kibrab, kindly make your way to the stage. He's the Associate Dean for Global Engagement in the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, Director of the World Food Center, University of California, Davis, USA. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I would like to say good morning and welcome to this first session. We'll be talking about resilient and sustainable agriculture in the new normal. So if you ate today, thank a farmer, right? And our panelists today are working very hard to make sure that you're eating well today, tomorrow, in the next decade, and for the whole humanity for the next century and beyond. So if you thought the game yesterday, the World Cup game yesterday was exciting, let me tell you something. We have even more exciting panels today, so they will keep you at the edge of your seats. So the reason we wanted to talk about agriculture today is to think about the solutions from agricultural sector in order to limit or even reverse the effects of climate. If you don't stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in temperature by 2050 from the 1990 levels, as agreed in the Paris meeting, or even 2 degrees centigrade, we risk negative impacts such as high temperatures, erratic precipitation, local flooding and drought, forest fires, and rising sea levels. We have already begun to see these effects. We have all seen the devastating floods that happened a few months ago in Pakistan, and it has caused damages worth more than $30 billion already. So in agriculture, we would expect to see new diseases, declining agricultural productivity, food security, and challenges to food security, and things like that. So what can we do about it? Well, first, since we are already experiencing the effects of climate change, we need to adapt to it. And there are several ways to do adaptation in agriculture. So our first speaker will be talking about the development and use of new and improved varieties with tolerance properties to floods. And our second speaker will be addressing the use of genome editing and advanced breeding technologies to cope with plant diseases. There are also other technologies that confer drought resistance, smart water management, heat tolerance in livestock, and sustainable land management. Those kind of things need to be accelerated in the near future. Second, we need to mitigate agriculture's contribution to climate change. And there are several strategies in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from crop production and livestock sector. For those of you who attended the session on Saturday, I talked about what we are doing to reduce or to mitigate the effect of climate change from the livestock sector. So today, we're going to be focusing more on the crop side of things. And our third speaker will address the role of soil in reaching net zero emissions in agriculture. Our mitigation strategies include increasing the ability to capture carbon dioxide by afforestation, planting cover trees, feed additives to reduce methane from ruminants, and other innovations as well. Third, we need to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience. And this includes using smart agricultural applications such as forecasting, AI, or should I say intelligence augmented, as we learned on Saturday, IoTs, sensors, unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, and so on. And our fourth speaker will address smart precision farming for a resilient food system. So as you can see, we have a fantastic set of panelists with huge experience in the field, and I, for one, cannot wait to hear what they have to say.
Thank you, Professor Kabrab. Please kindly take your seat, the seat that's right next to you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists of this discussion. Professor Pamela Ronald, Distinguished Professor in the Department of Plant Pathology and the Genome Center, University of California, Davis. She's also the Director of Grass Genetics at the Joint Bioenergy Institute in Emeryville, California, USA. Professor Ronald, we invite you to the stage. Next up, we would like to invite Professor Claudia Wagner-Riddle, School of Environmental Sciences, University of Guelph, Canada. Professor Wagner-Riddle, kindly make your way towards the stage. We also have Professor Josse de Berdemaker, former president of the European Association for Engineering Agriculture. Sir, we invite you to the stage. And we also have Dr. Van Schepler-Lew, plant pathology and host plant resistance at the International Rice Research Institute. We invite you to the stage as well. Ladies and gentlemen, right after the presentations, the speaker will take some time to answer your questions. We encourage everybody in the audience today to ask questions. Questions will be collected in person in this audience as well as online. So during Q&A, if you're here in person, please pass your questions to our mic people, and if you're online, kindly type your questions. All right, now the session will begin. Professor Kabrab, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So I would like to ask Professor Pamela Ronand to give us her keynote speech.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm very pleased to be here, and many thanks to the VinFuture Secretariat for arranging so many wonderful events this week. So as Emmaus said, climate change produces more and more challenges for farmers. One huge challenge is flooding. In this region of the world, in South and Southeast Asia, it's predicted that flooding can create huge problems for farmers. 4 million tons of rice, enough to feed 30 million people, is lost every year to flooding. A number of years ago, through many collaborations, contributions of many, many scientists at the International Rice Research Institute were able to identify an ancient rice variety that had a really amazing property. It could withstand up to 2 weeks of flooding, whereas most rice varieties will die after 3 days. Using conventional approaches of breeding, it's somewhat difficult to bring those useful traits, which are encoded by genes, into varieties grown by farmers. Using older technologies, we weren't able to introduce these traits very precisely. So my colleagues, Dave McKill, Kinong Xu, and others decided to try to isolate this gene that we named Sub1A to see if we could introduce the trait very precisely and create varieties that would be useful for farmers. So this is Dave McKill, a longtime collaborator of mine, and Kinong Xu, who first mapped this locus in the 90s, called Submergence Tolerance 1. So we began to work together in 1995 to try to isolate this gene. We were able to isolate the gene, and this shows you what these plants look like. So these were plants that were engineered in my laboratory at UC Davis. On the left is a conventional variety that has been grown for 2 weeks and then completely submerged in water for 2 weeks. And although most rice varieties like to grow in water, if they're completely submerged, most rice varieties will die, as you see in this control plant here. Well, the plant that we engineered to produce the Sub1A gene really could survive this flood. So this was a really exciting advancement. So we knew we had identified a single gene that can confer this tolerance to submergence, but we wanted to know how this gene would work in the hands of farmers. So this was a project then that was developed by Dave McKill as well as Abdel Ismail and others at the International Rice Research Institute to use a modern technology called marker-assisted breeding to bring the gene into varieties grown by farmers. And what I'm going to show you is a time-lapse video that was taken over 4 months, so you can see how these varieties perform in the field. On the left, you will see a conventional variety called IR64, and then on the right, you will see the variety carrying the Sub1 gene. Sorry, on the left is the variety carrying the Sub1 gene. So they both grow very well at first, but then when a 2-week flood is applied, you can see that that conventional variety doesn't grow very well, whereas the submergence tolerant variety really thrives and produces a really nice crop of seed. And in fact, in this controlled experiment in the field at the International Rice Research Institute, they're able to harvest 3-fold more grain than the conventional variety. Now, Dave then carried out many years of field experiments, and the whole team was able to visit farmers in India and Bangladesh. And what you're looking at here is a on-farm trial. So this is natural flooding. And so flooding has been increasing with duration and frequency over many years and is predicted to continue as the climate changes. And so you can see in the farmer's field where they've planted both varieties, and in this case it's a different genetic background called Swarna that's favored by farmers in this area. You can see by adding the sub-1 trait, the rice varieties really survive very well the flood, and in fact, farmers are seeing a 60% yield advantage in these varieties. So this project has really been quite successful with the help of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other donors. The seed's been distributed widely, and last year, more than 6 million farmers were growing sub-1 rice. So one big question about technology is who benefits from new technologies? And this continues to be a really important question as we consider new technologies. My colleagues at UC Berkeley and Tufts carried out a study in Eastern India. And this portion where he carried out his study is blown up there. And they looked at 128 villages, and the farmers were able to choose which seed variety that they wanted, either the Swarna sub-1 seed or the Swarna seed that they were already growing. And what you see in red are highland areas, and then the other areas are lowland areas that are prone to flooding. And one important aspect in India is that there are socially disadvantaged farmers that have been growing rice on flood-prone regions for hundreds of years. So this is a generational disadvantage. And what Kyle Emmerich and his team found is they confirmed earlier results that the Swarna sub-1 variety provides a massive yield advantage, 45% yield advantage, and that these areas that were historically occupied by the socially marginalized group really benefited tremendously, because when there's more flooding, sometimes farmers could not harvest any seed. So this result shows that sub-1A benefits the world's poorest farmers. Now, I just want to finish by saying food insecurity and poor nutrition still touch far too many. I'm optimistic, though, that our tremendous international agricultural scientific community, represented by many of you here, and by our talented students who we've had the honor of meeting during this trip, will continue to produce very important innovations to address the challenge of a changing climate. And we know when agriculture thrives, fewer people go hungry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ronald. May I ask Dr. VinFuture to come to the stage and deliver her keynote speech?
Good morning, everyone, and I'm very delighted to be here today. Today, I would like to talk about gene editing, but more general about advanced breeding technologies in coping with plant disease. So plant disease account for 20 to 30% yield loss. And not only so, the intensive use of pesticides, herbicides have a tremendous impact on soil health as well as human health. Importantly, pests and pathogens evolve faster than plants. They can migrate without borders, and changing climates have great impacts on the disease distributions as well as the severity worldwide. So our big questions are, how can we quickly map out the changing landscape of rice disease to identify new emerging pathogens and to be able to forecast the disease outbreak? Second, how we can then quickly identify new disease-resistant genes towards the new emerging pathogens. And how we can then quickly develop new resistance cultivar that then also, when we have those cultivars, how can we deploy them effectively? So to answer the first questions, how can we map out the pathogen distribution and identify new emerging strains, we need to have a global pathogen surveillance and monitoring network that can provide information on disease, occasion, incidence, the pathogen diversity and distributions, the effectiveness of resistant chains, the resistant profiles of resistant varieties, but also, more importantly, be able to forecast the disease outbreaks. And with that network, we'll be able to map out the pathogen population. And once we identify new pathogens, strains that we do not have an effective resistant chains for, we then have to quickly be able to identify new disease resistant chains. And to do that, we need to have a very efficient strategy for disease-resistant gene discovery that started by understanding the pathogen valence mechanism, utilize diverse germplasm, including landraces and wide variety as well, and in order to identify novel resistant source. And with that, we use diverse tools in forward and reverse genetics in order to identify candidate resistant genes that then can be validated using multiple molecular technologies, including gene editing. And with the validated resistant gene, we need to then be able to quickly develop a new resistant cultivar. And to do that, the breeders need to be able to combine and utilize all of these advanced crop improvement technologies as listed here. And among these, conventional breedings and hybridizations are based on crossing of two individuals, either coming from the same plant species or from closely related species. Mutagenesis, on the other hand, use variations or other chemical mutagens to cause random mutation in the plant genome. The common limitation of these three methods are they need a lot of, we need intensive screening, and therefore it costs a lot of time. Transgenics is, on the other hand, allow us to transfer a beneficial chain from any organism into the plants. But this can also create a trait that had not occurred in the nature before. That's why it requires intensive risk assessment. Gene editing emerged as the most advanced crop improvement technology that allows us to produce precise mutation in the plant genomes. And because gene-edited crops do not contain transgenes, therefore they can be regulated as conventional bred varieties. And gene editing has been used to improve many traits from different crops, including disease-resistant traits as well. As by having those, so if the breeder are able to combine those technology, they will be able to really quickly develop new resistant cultivar. And with that, then we ask, how can the breeder know where they can deploy those varieties so that the resistance can be more effective? Very commonly that a resistant cultivar is deployed broadly in order to increase the economical impact. But eventually, the resistant cultivar will be overlapped with a valence pathogen that persists in the population at low frequency. And that then allows the valent pathogen to multiply and cause the outbreaks in the next season. But if we are able to detect the shift of the pathogen population right early on, we'll be able to recommend the deployment of a suitable resistant cultivar. So with that, I hope to convince you that by having a diverse panels of resistant cultivar, either produced traditionally or using gene editing as a new crop improvement technology, and having a robust pathogen surveillance, monitoring, and forecasting system, we will be able to then customize, deploy the resistant cultivar so that the resistance is durable in order to prevent the outbreak from happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. W. May I ask Professor Wagner-Riedel to come and give a keynote speech?
Professors, we kindly remind you that your speaking time is around 5 minutes, so if you can wrap it up within 5 minutes, that'll be fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here. So I'm going to jump right into it, and going to talk to you about the role of soil in reaching net zero emissions in agriculture. So we had an introduction about the impact of climate change on agriculture. What I'm going to talk about is the impact of agriculture on climate change. So food systems are estimated to be responsible for about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and that includes the growing of food, animals, deforestation associated with agriculture, and the delivery of food, processing, transport, and consumption. Obviously, it varies a lot depending on the region, but globally, overall, it's 30%. If we drill down onto this land systems production of greenhouse gases, we see that that's about 24%, so one quarter. Oops, here we go. And it's associated also with deforestation due to agriculture. About 50% of the one quarter is due to on-farm activities. And drilling down into that, you heard yesterday Professor Ermias Kabrab talking about methane emissions from enteric fermentation. So we tend to think about agriculture as mostly methane, but a large proportion is related to soil, nitrogen, carbon processes. Particularly, I want to point out to you, the use of inputs such as synthetic fertilizer is a large proportion of it. So how can we address that? Through climate-smart soil practices that are aimed at increasing the carbon uptake, but also reducing nitrous oxide emissions. There are two arrows shown in this diagram because with nitrogen, we have the cascade of effects in the sense that we have losses of nitrogen that is N2O that is directly produced in soil, as well as any other nitrogen loss from the system can be emitted into the atmosphere as N2O, nitrous oxide, which is the third most important potent greenhouse gas. So there are a number of practices. I'm going to concentrate on the nutrient management, which is really about nitrogen management. These practices do have co-benefits that relate back to the title of the session of making agriculture more resilient, because by increasing carbon in the soil, we make the system less vulnerable to both extreme drought and localized flooding. So my first take-home message is that it's not all about carbon. Nitrogen is a really important component of addressing the emissions of greenhouse gases from agriculture. The second message is that because we cannot grow crops without nitrogen, we need to improve the delivery of nitrogen to plants. So that involves innovation in products and fertilizer products, as well as innovation in terms of how that nitrogen is delivered to the plant. Right now, we apply it to the soil and hope that some of it makes it into the plant. So by better managing this, we have potential to reduce emissions. So part of my research is to quantify how these, some of these practices reduce nitrous oxide emissions from soils, both by using innovative measurement methods that rely on sampling of air and quantifying turbulence in the atmosphere that allow us for getting year-round data, in contrast to the typical method, which is manual and relies on sporadic measurements. We then integrate this information into biogeochemical models and extend it over larger areas and over larger time frames to scale up and combine this with the economics. So contrary to investments in genetics that will provide a return on investment, for environmental purposes, there's really no motivation for farmers to use those practices. So we also work with implementation and trying to convince farmers to use these better practices. So my third and final message is that it's not all about technology, but it's also about behavior and really understanding how these decisions are driven. So we need more psychologists studying farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wagner-Riedel. May I ask Professor Jos de Barkemarker to come to the podium, please?
Good morning. And when we have talked about seeds and breeding, then we know that's part of a chain, of the value chain in agriculture. If you go from the left to the right, that's when you start the breeding. In the end, there has to be consumers that have to like the product. It has to be nutritious for them. And there's many steps in between. And all those steps, they can be subjected to variability, but also to disruptions. And some of those disruptions may come at the production stage, but also at the storage stage. So we really have to take that in mind. Of course, there is also that the consumer will tell also to the breeder, to the producer, to the storer, to the manufacturer, what he likes and what he doesn't like. So there's also information backflow to all those intermediate steps. So when we have that now on the production, we could say that the yield that we have in the end, what we can consume, is the result of a complex interaction. This is much too simplified. Complex interaction between the genetics, the management, and the environment. The environment being the soil, being also the climate changes. The management is what the farmer does, and the genetics, of course, is something that he decides also on to do that. But there is one thing that is sure, is that the variability in agriculture, in the agricultural production, is a fact. The circumstances change. They change with place, they change with time. And then the question is how to do the right things. So the 4 R's, the right time, in the right place, in the right way, with the right inputs. That's the question. If the farmer has managed these things then very well, maybe he can see the results. Let's just see what is the results of such an interaction, a complex interaction. Here it's the yield of a field. It's a small field, it's 10-hectare field. And when you look at the different colors, the dark colors are really the low yields, and the light colors, the yellow ones, are the high yields that we had in that field. So you have in that field many different yields that come there. And if you take the ones on the top left, that is very low yields, and if you really calculate it, the farmer should not have done anything. He's not making money, he's losing money on those parts of the field. Now, what is happening on the bottom right is that there is probably a previous crop that was involved there, potatoes. Potatoes that left too much nitrogen in the field on the top. On the left side, you had a previous crop was corn. And corn, there they used herbicides, atrazine, herbicide that also has its effect the next year, and maybe even the next year. So these are management things the year before, the things that he did the year before has an effect on the next year. So these are decisions he has to make observations he has to make. And fortunately, we were lucky that we had all this information on this field, so we could show a farmer that what you did last year will affect your income this year, and will also affect your income next year. So basically, a farmer has to document his things. And we also heard from the previous speaker, also in terms of emissions, but also in terms of management, he should document and make observations of what is happening. What is happening to the soil? What is happening to the plants? What is happening to the vigor of the plants? Are they really looking good? And then also look at weeds, because they are the competing thing in yields. And so on the one hand, he can have that data collection for spatial, temporal management, and then could make models. But on the other hand, if you have that data, you may have enough information to also see what would happen if there is a disaster, if the variability, if a disturbance is too big. So this is where we have to get in. And then you can say, well, where there's artificial intelligence, would that not offer a solution here? Because we have all those data. We'll have all those data, hopefully, in the near future, on many farms and many observations from on the soil, earth observations by satellites, sensors in the field, counting of pests, counting of weeds. And we also have then artificial intelligence that probably can make a good model out of those data and tell us what is now the best practice that we could do. If we have to make a decision for the crop that we do next year, can we rely on the information, the smart farmer, the smart agriculture? Can I say agricultural intelligence is another way that we could use here, could be used for better production in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now we move to the panel discussion. And let me ask you, Professor Ronald, thank you for sharing your fascinating work on developing this rice varieties. And I know you're working on many other things as well. So what excites you? And in the future, what kind of things are you working on to help farmers adapt to climate change?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. So we are very excited about new knowledge on what are the exact molecules between the plant and the pathogen that are interacting to provide a disease outcome. So as Van mentioned, as the climate changes, we're going to have more pathogen and pest pressures. And traditionally, farmers would bring in genes from natural populations, and this will continue to be a really important fundamental aspect of breeding. But there are also new approaches that engineer completely new specificities. So these resistance genes that Van were talking about essentially are genes that encode receptors, and they can recognize molecules produced by microbes. So if you know what the microbial population is, you can predict what type of virulence factors are going to be produced in that environment. And then you can begin to engineer new resistance genes. So that's something we're really excited about in my lab. We are using modern approaches to engineer completely new genes, and then we can put them back into the plants and see if we can have a broader spectrum resistance. And this is a strategy that many labs are taking, so that we can develop resistance to pests or pathogens that we previously had no ability to control.
Great, thank you. So staying with that theme, Dr. Shepler-Liu, you're doing a lot of work with genome editing crop varieties. And as we know, climate change is not waiting for anybody, right? So what are the barriers? What prevents you from getting those genome editing varieties into the farmer's hands?
Hello, is this on? Yeah. Okay, that is a very good question, actually. Yeah, we've been involving in a project to produce bacterial blight-resistant rice cultivar for Asia and Africa. And yes, we face a lot of problems in order to bring those edited material to the farmers. There are Currently, many countries has been open for gene-edited crops, but most of them are in developed countries. You see the US, Australia, Japan, Canada, some country in Latin America, but the country where we are targeting, where the most smallholder farmers are living, only few of them are open for gene-edited crops. There's only 2 countries in Africa, like Nigeria and Kenya, accepting gene-edited crops. 1 country in South Asia, India, is open for that, and in Southeast Asia, which have Philippines. And because the regulatory aspect is not well distributed, that's why we have an issue to choose which country we can be moving our material into. And also it's difficult for a country who exports rice cultivar. For example, Vietnam is exporting rice, right? So if you be accepting edited crop, you would need to have 2 parallel production programs. One would be exporting to the market, which just accept traditionally bred variety, and the other for the markets that accept gene-edited crops. So that makes them very difficult, and it's costly as well. The second issue we also have is like different countries have a different biosafety regulation in order to deregulate the gene-edited crops. So we need to comply with so many requirements, and that takes time. And the third issue is, of course, CRISPR's patents. And while it's still a debate in the France who own the technologies, many of these institutes have given the exclusive licensing to many different companies. And that's for us very difficult to negotiate with them to get the freedom to operate, to be able to deliver those products which are for the humanitarian project, for the smallholder farmers. So that are the things that we are facing at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So now going into the mitigation aspects, Professor Wagner-Riedl, you shared different types of mitigation options that are available. I was wondering if those mitigation options are additive. Would a farmer be able to use more than one type of mitigation options? If so, what do you think would be sort of the maximum level of benefit or reduction that the farmer can see?
So they're definitely additive. And we are actually talking about stacking of practices in that realm. Because, well, we know farmers don't just do one thing. And we can get the most benefit by combining a number of practices, both for carbon and for nitrogen management. Now, overall, what kind of impact will that have? That varies a lot from the starting point. But some estimates, like it's not very large in terms of global emissions. So around 5%, it would be, I think, an optimistic value in terms of offsetting. I think the most important aspect is that these practices are going to help us in a transition period, so because they can be applied now. And then secondly, the co-benefits in terms of making the agricultural system more resilient to climate change, because the kind of dual purpose practices to both mitigate but also make the system more resilient.
Thank you very much. So one of the things that I've experienced being here for a couple of days in the VinFuture Prize Award Week is that you invariably find yourself sitting to a prominent scientist and in different fields. And so I was talking to Dr. Huang from Microsoft, and he was asking me, what can AI do for agriculture? So now I flip that question to you, Professor De Barkemarker, to just to say a few words about, what can AI do for agriculture? What does the future for smart agriculture look like?
I think, as I pointed out in my talk, there is a future for AI in agriculture. But one of the main problems we have is the data and the data quality. Because farmers, they can write down things, but if they all write it down differently or have a different interpretation of what they did, then how do you put that into AI algorithms? There's also a number of sensors on the market, but the number of those sensors, for example, for plant vigor, chlorophyll content, there is some crop indices that are being used by satellites, by airborne devices, by UAVs, even on the ground sensors, but they all seem to have a little bit of a different interpretation of which is the index they have to use. So we have still a large discrepancy between all the tools that are collecting data and the quality of the data, or whether those data converge to somewhere. And that's where AI should help us. Because I think in the AI, we need lots of good data. Because poor data will give us probably some poor information and poor guidance, or maybe just will get the farmer confused and not get us anywhere. And that's one of the things, is the data collection is one of the important parts. Now, there's also other discussions going on, is who owns the data? Because data regulations in Europe, the GDPR, there is some inclination to say that the one that produces the data is the owner of the data. So who produces the data? The farmer, or is it the combine manufacturer? There's a discussion that you can have. This discussion will come into regulations that come later. And then the farmers say, how will we profit from giving our data to all those companies? Because they do it, I think they do it also for human benefits for mankind, but they also do it to make some profit, probably, from those things. So how can we share the profits?
Great, thank you. Let me ask this question to Dr. Shapter-Lu, and then maybe you will have something to add to it as well. So there are a number of diseases and pests that are coming up, and with climate change, you will see that some pests will expand their areas of influence and all that. So how do you keep ahead of those potential diseases and pests that are not yet there, but they will be coming in? So do you screen for those things, and how do you prepare for crops and plants to have those genes that will give them resistance to some of the diseases that we don't know they will or they will not come?
Right. Yes. So climate change has huge impacts on the pathogens, not only the way they grow, but also the evolutionary aspect of the pathogens. So disease which were not important in the past, for example, the fungus moths. In the past, we were saying when you see fungus moths, it means you are going to have a golden harvest. But it's no longer true for now. So fungus moths is seen everywhere, also in South Asia and Southeast Asia as well. So we need to be able to prepare for that. And one of the things that I was proposing here on the slide was to have a very large network of the right pathologies, including they are linked to the farmers who are going to the field and be able to collect and identify those diseases, so that we can quickly capture if there are any new emerging pathogen strains. And with that strain, being able to understand its virulence mechanism, searching for new resistant genes, and be able then to deploy them specifically at the area where the resistance is providing a strong effectiveness to the pathogens. So that had to come together, as included the right pathologies and the genetics and the breeders, so that we have a much faster ways of from understanding the pathogen to the delivery of rice cultivar to the farmers. So yes, that would be my proposal.
Do you want to add something to that?
Sure, thank you. That is absolutely really important to survey the the variants out there, and it's similar to what we're thinking about the COVID variants, right? So variants keep coming up. So it's completely analogous. And as many of us know, scientists are looking for a multivalent vaccine, so we don't have to keep vaccinating specifically to specific variants that arise. And that's something plant pathologists are also doing, is trying to engineer resistance that is very broad spectrum. And there has been some success already, and it's using genome editing. So for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with it, genome editing is a really important new technology where you can search, for example, 45,000 rice genes, and you can engineer a specific molecule that will attack a specific location in a gene, and you can clip it out. And so there are genes in plants that make a plant susceptible to sometimes a whole class, a whole pathogen class. So what scientists are doing now is disrupting those susceptibility factors and then simply putting that out into the field. So I think it's a very complementary approach to this other breeding approach.
Thank you. Well, while we are on the subject, let's talk about gene editing. A lot of people, there's a lot of discussion, and we hear a number of people or governments that are wary of gene editing technology. So where do you think this fear for this technology comes in? Is it completely safe? And what feeds this fear?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting and important question. I probably don't have a simple answer. But certainly, I think what we can say with genome editing, genetic engineering, hybridization, there's actually many types of modern genetic technologies that we weren't using 100 years ago. And the National Academy of Sciences and the European Food Safety Institute and virtually all major scientific institutions have concluded that the modern approaches for genetic improvement are no more risky than older approaches. And, that's very sciencey, and we can't say everything that we do will be safe, but it's really no more risky than older approaches, and we're doing it with a lot more knowledge. But still, there has been a lot of misinformation that is spreading. And again, thinking about COVID, it's amazing. There's many people that still do not want to be vaccinated because what they read on the internet, and I think there are going to be people we cannot reach. But I do think that as people become more engaged with agriculture, start thinking about climate change, start seeing perhaps in their localities that there are challenges producing food, there's more openness to modern technologies for conferring higher yields. So I think it's very hopeful, and there's sort of a split around the world. Many countries are accepting genome editing without regulation. Whereas older technologies such as genetic engineering are still highly regulated in virtually all countries. So we are going forward with modern approaches, and I think as scientists we're optimistic that those tools are very important in the toolbox, and that they will be accepted in many communities. But I'd love to hear what other people think about that.
Great, thank you. So staying with controversial issues in agriculture, Professor Wagner-Riedel, there's a lot of debate about carbon sequestration in the soil. There are some folks who would say that we can only store carbon in the soil for a short period of time, and something changes, it go back up into the atmosphere. And others feel that a lot of the pasture-based agriculture should get credit for the carbon that's drawn in and storing it in the soil. So can you help us understand about soil carbon, and should we consider it as something that would help us sequester carbon, or in what circumstances do we say, okay, this is something that will help us in carbon sequestration, in other places it's not?
Yeah, so I think that it can help us, but let's not hang all of our hopes into that or put all of our eggs into that basket, because it is the issue is, as you mentioned, the permanence. And to me, it's more about let's put that carbon in the soil because of the reasons that it's going to make our soil more productive. The water holding capacity is going to be higher. Crops are going to be less susceptible to those big swings of rain and drought. Let's do it for those reasons. And then the other side of this, let's not forget about the nitrogen, because the reduction in N2O emissions, those are not related to permanency. If you invest in managing nitrogen better, you know that those emissions are going to go down as long as the farmers continue doing those practices. In terms of carbon, even for some farmers, they may not want to commit because they would have to commit for 20 to 50 years on doing certain practice, while on the nitrogen side, that could be done on a shorter period of time. So I think those are a couple of things that I would consider in relation to this controversial issue.
Great, thank you. So talking about precision agriculture, Professor de Baartmaecker, does it have a role in low-income countries? So in some low-income countries, we may not have easy access to sensors and other fancy technology. So what's the role of precision agriculture in those instances? If there are some examples that you can share with us, how farmers, smallholder farmers in low-income countries can benefit from this.
I could share some of our initial experiments on precision agriculture, and you don't want to know what technology we used at that time. It was our eyes and walking in the field, and that's basically what every farmer has available. I think this is where we should start. The next start, and maybe I should talk about it a little bit, is the code of conduct, the good agricultural practices. And I've seen with our farmers in Europe, in Belgium, that when they have to adhere to a good code of practice, they have to write down things. They have to write down what they do. So they have to do what they claim that they do, and that can be controlled. And when they write down things, they already can start to calculate. And we have seen that with farmers, that they do that. So they say, hey, what did we put in? What did we get out? So they calculate that way. What incentivizes them a little bit is also, in some organizations, they say, we want to have products that are produced under a good code of practice, under good agricultural practices. You know, then writing down, that's the start of precision agriculture, is really your access to the market. And that's important for a farmer, because it's being able to sell the crop or not. And I think this is also important for small farmers. There's no size involved in that. The large ones have perhaps more technology available or need more technology because they cannot walk the fields, they don't know their crops, they don't see their crops as often as a small farmer has. So precision agriculture is observation, record, make decisions, observation again. Every time you do something, you have to see what is the result of what you do. And that's where you start in precision agriculture. And it can be that your field has one part where you never make money, but you forgot it because you always have the tradition, and that's a big tradition we have to fight, that the farmer would like to have his crop a uniform look in the field. Because if neighbors may think he's a bad farmer when you have some patches in there that are poor, well, that's the wrong thing. He should allow to have those poor patches because that's where he has pollution, that's where he's losing money. And that's an attitude that also has to change.
Great, thank you. We could talk about this for hours, but I'm also mindful about the time. So now I would like to open this to the audience. I've already received a number of questions from people already, but any questions from the audience? I see already here, Dr. Wong.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now proceed to the Q&A. I believe there's a question in front. Our audiences in person can ask questions. Can we have the mic to the front row? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the fascinating discussion, especially, this is related to all of us on the mouth, right? There are 2 points I want to really make here. Professor Ronald made a very good point that, we need a kind of foundation model that can be adapted for different variants. This is exactly what is happening in the area of AI. Another point is about the Professor Dear Brad Maker. Yes, the data quality is super important, but even more important one is really how you can bring different kinds of data together. Like the discussion we had last night, you have the data from satellite, they're watching the planet all the time. You have the weather, they're here. Nobody is actually owning the weather, right? And you can have custom data with precision. You can really correlate with all those different sources of data together. That is actually the kind of breakthrough in AI recently, like the foundation model. You create one model, like GPT 3.5, you can be adapted for different areas, whether it's a translation, summarization, or writing a very good scientific paper, right? It's the one model that can be applied for different variants, very much like what Professor Ronald said. So I would actually really urge the community work together. Do not try to protect the data that belong to the benefit of humanity. That's actually really use all the data available, clean them up, but bring all those data together. The tooling is available. The recent breakthrough from OpenAI is a case in point. Just the power of computing, the tooling, they are available. They can be applied to agriculture really for the benefit of humanity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Very well said.
Can I make a follow-up point on that? Yesterday in my talk, I had talked about the creation of platforms. And so what XD has been talking about is the back end of the platform, is where all the data streams are coming in and the sophisticated AI that combines multimodal data. I think equally important is the front end of these platforms. So how do we create a front end which feels very familiar to farmers in different communities? So have it localized to not only the language, but also the culture of the communities. Have it low code, no code, so that they can speak in whatever way they want, and so that there are places on this platform where people can engage in their own community, be incented to add their data, and be able to ask their questions and get some answers, setting up a virtuous cycle of bringing their data in and immediately getting something useful out of it. So I think something like a Jupyter-based platform, open source, which enabled this with people thinking about the front end, the culture of farmers in different areas, combined with a very sophisticated back end, could be the motivation we need to get the farmers directly engaged in this.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. I feel like the agricultural extension 2.0 is coming along. All right, so we have another question over here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your speaker. I have one question for Professor Bam Miller. This for sub-1, because I cooperation with Dr. Markil and Dr. Ismail, and 15 years for the sub-1. I apply sub-1 for Vietnam. But this I saw in sub-1 IR64 and very good compared with another variety in Vietnam. But in the future, and you have the need develop the new gene for the sub-1, because this we need the high gene more, because this the farmer before, and I yield the sub-1 Sawa IR64 sub-1, and we yield in Mekong Delta. So the gene very low, very good for the submergent, but this the gene very low. So the farmer don't like apply. So in the future, maybe you need more the gene and the sub one and the high gene, like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's flooding is also a problem in Vietnam, as you mentioned, the Mekong Delta, and there's talented rice breeders in Vietnam for a very, very long time, and I know rice breeders have been introducing sub-1 into locally adapted varieties, and just for the broader audiences, different rice growing regions prefer different varieties. So one really exciting breakthrough, I think, in the field of breeding is you can specifically bring in a trait into that genetic background, but not change other aspects that the farmers value, such as aroma or taste. Yield should not be changed. It should just be enhanced in flooding. So I think your question comes to, well, we need not only submergence tolerance, we need other traits, high yield traits. We need to continue to improve pest and disease, and that's why we really will continue to rely on our rice breeders who continue to stack what we call gene stacking. So you don't only bring in submergence tolerance, you might bring in the golden rice cassette, which is a high nutrition for vitamin A, and so you might bring in a new pest resistance. And so that is something that's certainly going on, and it truly is an international collaboration working on this. And thanks to the International Rice Research Institute, which often coordinates many of these field-based activities, whether it's in Vietnam, or we had the privilege of visiting the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute, the Cuttack Rice Research Institute in Eastern India. So there's a talented global team of breeders that are looking at many of these challenges.
We have another question over there.
Okay. Yeah. I wanted to ask about the connection with the genetics for advanced agriculture and the preservation of biodiversity and cultural diversity. And we know that indigenous communities manage in some way formally, in some ways informally, up to 80% of global biodiversity. We also know that we're going to have to protect much more of the planet for nature going forward as we have to feed more and more people. And I was wondering if the panelists could discuss, and we heard a little bit in Jose's comments as well, about the opportunities to think about how we can leverage what we're calling laboratory technology for advanced species, more resilient species, more climate-resistant species, more drought-resistant species, with some of the efforts to partner with indigenous communities around their approaches to both income but also protecting the natural world. And of course, we've seen in COVID what happens when you cut away the buffer of biodiversity from our natural world. So I'd love any of the comments in terms of what are some of the, not the long term, but what are some of the immediate things that can happen. Erie, for example, partnered with Masipag to do indigenous grains of rice that were more resistant, that had much less year-to-year variability than did some of the advanced species, including golden rice. How do those partnerships play in with indigenous communities?
Right, I think, let me just say a little bit about that. So there's the Orphan Crops Consortium that is trying to make sure that a lot of the crops that have been kind of forgotten are actually being researched, and they're trying to make sure that those are adapted to that area and enhancement on those kind of things. So that kind of work is happening, but probably not at the pace that we would like. But anybody else want to add to that?
I can add into that. So for breedings or improving crops variety, it's very important to have this diverse germplasm coming from land races, wild rice species. So that are very important material to source for an interesting or targeting trait. But on the other hand, we will be able to utilize and bring of this germplasm into a more modern breeding program to diversify also our crops and make this more resilient to climate change. But on the other hand, we could also use the technology to evolve those land races to make them more resilient and produce more yields, for example, because those varieties are often low yielding and they have a lot of pests. And we can also bring new technology to improve them as well. So there's both positive interaction of taking the resource for improving the modern cultivars, but also to improve those traditional cultivars.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to that. So for those of you that don't know, the International Rice Research Institute has about 100,000 different land races and different species. Vietnam is really a hotspot of rice biodiversity. They also have thousands of different diverse varieties and species. So there is an ongoing effort to bring in those genes from indigenous varieties. So that continues to be incredibly important, but there's also sort of this new approach, which I think Van is touching on, whereas essentially all of us eat the same rice species. So there's varieties and species. So we eat the same species, but there are other rice species that are resilient, for example, to salt stress, but they don't produce very good yield. So what scientists are doing is, instead of adding genes to varieties that farmers are already growing, they'll take a completely different wild species and try to edit the genome to produce higher yields and carry traits for farmers. So that's a really exciting area that people are working on in different aspects of plant genetics.
Thank you. I think I saw a hand over there.
I also want to make sure that we're able to answer some online questions as well. But yes, gentlemen.
I'm Trí from Mimosatech, a startup of Vietnam who providing the precision farming practice based on an IoT solution. So I think that together with the long-term solution of gene editing, the precising farming practice to correct the farmer to use correct water fertilizer will be very suitable solution to in the climate change adaptation and mitigation. But in Vietnam, you know that there are a lot of smallholder farmers, mostly smallholder farmers. And the infrastructure is very basic. The infrastructure here I mean, for example, for the drip irrigation, pivot center, or the sprinkler is a few percent for water applying. So it is very difficult to, you know, that we able to have some model for AI, and we collect data and we give the decision. But when we deploy that decision to that very basic infrastructure, it's very hard. For example, if we would like to apply for recycled water or fertilizer, but manually the farmer do that, how we make sure that they will apply the precise amount of what the model advises. So my question is, with the smallholder farmers, is it very hard to invest for advanced infrastructure as well as technology? And if we would like to push the precision farming practice to all of smallholder farmers, what is the signal, a good signal for some technology provider like us to penetrate to the market? Or if we would like to make the precision farming practice to all of smallholder farmers with the good collaboration model between the government, big corporations, startup farmer, or everybody in the supply chain. So I would like to have some advice from Professor Joes on this. Thank you.
There is something between micros and myself. But I think small farmers, as you said, that if they don't know how to operate the equipment well, then the first job is train them. I think you have to train them to operate the equipment, and you have to train them and show them the benefit of doing this in some way. Because I think most of the time it goes through the money. That's the incentive in many cases. The other one is if the government also has the rules on good agriculture practices. And good agriculture practices have been written down with the environment in mind, could be better, but also with guaranteeing to the consumer and also guaranteeing to the farmer that he's doing it in the right way. And once you start writing down, once the farmer starts writing down, you get there. And it doesn't have to be a big farmer, but it has to have training. I think training and education of farmers, that's important. And by the way, if you have access to the database of good agriculture practices, because they also write down or they have some information on their income from what they have been doing, then you also have a source for the data that you could use in artificial intelligence. It may not be the 1 square meter grid, but you have at least a number of good information sources for farmers. And I think it is, yes, it is not that you can go to the farmer and tell him, here I have this wonderful irrigation system. If you apply this, you will be very happy and a good farmer. No, you have to really hold his hand and help him with that. Because you bring in a thing that is a little bit new. He knows plants, but he doesn't, maybe he's not so familiar with the technology behind it and the reasoning that you have had in putting it together. So there is a good chance of doing it.
Thanks. So we have a question from online that I would like to ask to Professor Wagner-Riedel. Can carbon farming be a viable solution for farmers to ensure both productivity and climate change mitigation? What would be the challenges and barriers?
Yeah, I think the barriers are in terms of, you know, many farmers, this is how we've always done it, right? So I think it goes to back to the point of education and training. So I think it can be a win-win. And the third win is the economic one, which is not always clearly evident, particularly with carbon, because a lot of these investments are long-term investments. So carbon changes in the soil or on the landscape take many years to accumulate. So it's not something that you see an improvement in yields or in the soil quality right away. So that's back to the education and training and showing examples. And we're seeing a lot of very successful farm to farm, like so peer training. So taking the innovative farmers that already do things because they're interested in they're just curious and like being different and trying different things, and taking them to as role models for the rest of the community. So I think it definitely could be that even triple win, but not without some investment in the education and training part.
Great, thank you.
I believe there's another online question that was sent to us on Zoom by Mr. Lung Vit Guk, and his question is, how can drone technologies help in precision agriculture? Would anybody want to answer, our panelists and chair?
I think drone technologies have been promoted very heavily in many places in the world as being one of the information sources for precision agriculture, for the farmer to know. So those are his eyes in the air that he can have. And I think they have quite been successful in telling the farmer, where are the patches of weeds? Which weeds do you have? Disease detection, yes, but we discussed it also a little bit earlier. Maybe the resolution is a big problem because you have to have the disease before you really see it. So your drone has to be able to see it before you can see it with your eyes. That's the important part. So if that would be possible, then you could have really an advanced warning of something is coming. And you know, knowing that something is coming, then you can anticipate, then you can work on it. That's the important part. Maybe some other.
Yeah, I would like to add into that. So I have a visit to a company in the south, in Mekong Delta, and where they put a station to automatically monitoring the presence of pests on the rice field. And drone can be used there very efficiently to validate those data coming from the station, like to fly them out and check the area of damage. And can also, if that area is heavy infested by pests, farmer can then specifically spray pesticides in that area instead of spraying the whole field. That would also have to increase the effectiveness of controlling pests. But yeah, to move that to a disease is still a challenge because there is solution of that. So there is other technology that is more suitable, like people taking their handy and take a photo and scan out and being able to detect what disease that, and this information can be gathered for us then to identify the area of infection. So those technology is a feature, is really important, but also the issue with data, being able to gather this data, having a platform that can globally cooperating with the farmers and with the researcher to build in also model to forecast the disease as well. So that I see a challenge, but also an opportunity for large companies who are able to invest into those technologies.
Thank you, speakers, for giving us a wonderful discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, due to the time constraints and many unanswered questions still available, we would like to pass some of these questions on so that they can be answered after the seminar. So if you have further questions, feel free to email us. The information of the email is listed in the agenda on the table. So Professor Kabrab, any closing remarks for this discussion?
I just want to say thank you to the panelists. I think we have a fantastic set of discussions, and we touched on a number of things. We would have liked to talk even more. There's a lot of new technologies and new innovations that are coming in this field. I think the future of agriculture is bright. We should be able to make this transition not only in high-income countries, but in low-income countries as well. So I think we have to make sure that our focus is to improve productivity and do it in a sustainable manner throughout the world. So I just want to say thank you to the panelists, and also thank you to the audience for fantastic questions as well. So thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you, distinguished guests. Thank you, today's session chair, and thank you, our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, VinFuture Prize honors science and technology advancements that service humanity. We will continue with the second session, Advanced Materials for Future Energy Storage, at 11 a.m. sharp. See you back here at 10:50 a.m. And to those that have been registered to go to the networking session, kindly proceed downstairs according to the information written on your confirmation. Thank you, and see you back here in a few minutes.